If you've been anywhere near social media this past week, you've probably seen this. Maccabi Tel Aviv fans clashed with Palestine solidarity protesters in Amsterdam. Riot police intervened, arrests were made, and Western media is once again in the spotlight for how they covered the story. In today's show, we'll talk about what happened and why it could happen again. I'm Anelise Borges, and this is The Stream. Just how events unfolded in Amsterdam, in what order, and why is that important, are some of the questions our guests will help us go through today. Among them are residents of the city, including Martine Heijthuyzen, an activist and political content creator, Bassil Mikdadi, a sports journalist, founder and editor of footballpalestine.com, and Usaama, a rapper and activist, the only one not joining us from Amsterdam today. He's live with us from London. Thank you all so much for your time. Martine, I believe you were among the activists that asked the municipality of Amsterdam to cancel the match. That is before any of this actually happened. Why is that? Did you guys expect something like this to actually happen?
So I was not part of the collective that asked the mayor to cancel the match, but I was aware of the protest happening. And for us in Amsterdam, it actually, at least for me, it already started on Monday. We saw in the news that somebody with a kafaya was beating down in our central station. It happened it was done by Ajax supporters, but for me personally, it put this match on the agenda. And after that, we heard about the protest, how it was also replaced, like placed to another location by the mayor. But quite soon we started to inform each other as activists that we needed to be careful of how we were walking down the street, showing our solidarity with Palestine visibly. And we were starting to inform ourselves of the reputation that these hooligans had, right? They have quite a reputation within their own country, but also in other places in Europe. We heard that the Mossad was also joining them, and it became also quite clear to us who these supporters actually were, right? We saw on their socials that they, that they were part of the army that is now currently committing a genocide in Gaza. So it was safe to say that we were terrified as activists and as citizens of Amsterdam.
So again, even before this match and the events in the streets of Amsterdam actually took place, activists were quite concerned. Bassil, I know you're not physically near the riots themselves, but what can you tell us about the events that unfolded in your city, in Amsterdam?
Well, I think first and foremost, it's quite shocking. And I think it's a combination of things. One, Amsterdam has this reputation of being the city of free expression. And maybe the authorities thought that this was just going to be a normal football match. And there have been a lot of boisterous ultras groups that have passed by the city before. If you walk the city center, you see the stickers they leave by. Besiktas, an Istanbul-based club, was here in September. The police managed that relatively okay. There was no big incidents. There was 1 or 2 arrests for people trying to get into the stadium without a ticket. There was a brief confrontation in the city center because there's a large Turkish community here, and not everyone is a fan of Besiktas. Some are fans of other clubs. But more or less, the police knew how to handle that. And I think there was the assumption that, these are just football supporters. They're going to come here. They're going to enjoy the city. They're going to go to the match, and then they're going to go to their hotel, and the next day they're going to get on a plane and go home. And I think it became very, very evident from the day these supporters arrived here that that was not their intent at all. And I have to say I'm a little bit disappointed how it got framed and how politicians spoke about this, because the Maccabi fans came here and attacked people's personal property, ripped down flags all across the city, and just didn't conduct themselves well. And there was no real reaction until things really got out of hand. I mean, after the match and when a riot was underway in the city, that's when politicians thought, maybe we should do something about this. But it was too late. They had been in the city for 48 hours. And, for every action, there's going to be a reaction. And I think that's what happened here. I think it's a failure of the city to understand who these fans are and what they were here to do, which was not really watch a football match. We didn't talk about the game. We're not talking about Ajax beating Maccabi Tel Aviv 5-0. We're talking about all the incidents that happened before and after the match.
And Usaama, I came across a video you posted online saying that, and I'm quoting you, unlike the ICC and the ICJ, the streets have a quick judicial process. Is that what happened, do you think? Were people in Amsterdam actually responding to potentially a year and a half of genocide?
Yeah, I think every Israeli export, be it cultural, be it academic, be it sports, functions as an agent of their government. This is why, like with Eden Golan, for example, you saw when the European Broadcast Union took issue with their lyrics, the president of Israel got involved and said, actually change these lyrics because it is important that we're represented at Eurovision, right? And it's the same with sports. It's the same with these teams. And so when they are functioning in this way to normalize this rogue state, then it absolutely makes sense that people that have these frustrations with the genocide for a year are going to react to their presence. And this is like not even mentioning the fact that this team has a history, or their supporters have a history of also literally taking with them their racism and their incitement to violence and all these kind of things. So I do think that it is a response both to the genocide, but it is also kind of a physical manifestation of what we mean by not normalizing a rogue state and all of its exports.
And obviously the history of Israel being part of UEFA has a lot to do with normalizing the place of Israel in the world, I would say. But before we get more into that, there's a lot to say about how much the way this story was told also angered a lot of people, almost as much as the events themselves. And here is an old friend of the stream, content creator Catherine Bogan, saying that she doesn't agree that Europe is a dangerous place for a Jewish person like her. Take a look.
I'm a Jewish girl. I've spent plenty of time in Europe. I'm 100% confident I can travel safely throughout Europe. You know why? Because I'm not running around town screaming and pulling down residents' flags. I'm not in a huge group of aggressors chanting death to Arabs. Nobody would ever catch me singing a jingle about the dead children of Gaza. And in general, I wouldn't be walking around trying to be a vile, violent nuisance to the locals. I know, I could post up on any public street corner and light my Shabbat candles and wear my Star of David and invite people to say the Mourner's Kaddish and talk to them about being a Jew against genocide, and I would be fine. I would be fine. I would be absolutely safe.
Martina, that was part of the conversation online, wasn't it? Loads of people talking about how they felt as though Amsterdam was no longer safe to them. How did you feel when you came across these comments? You are a resident of Amsterdam. How did you react?
Well, I think if you're from here, we have since a year an extreme right-wing government, right? And they very much align themselves with Israel, not only like literally taking over the policies of Israel, but also in the way they legitimize themselves. The whole rhetoric is anti-Islam. So we really expected that the government parties would take everything that happened and frame it within their own narrative. What I think was really disappointing and what angered a lot of people is that the opposition parties, the parties that were supposed to, stand between the extreme right and the people, they also completely went with this narrative. They followed the Zionist playbook, not only in, stating that it was anti-Semitic attacks, but also, come on, we're in this for over a year. We've seen Israel spreading misinformation as a tactic, right? We've seen that with Hamas and the beheaded babies. We see Israel do that, and later on it gets rectified, but it's already too late. So we saw everything that's been happening for over a year and longer happen in our own city. So it angered a lot of people. And the only thing that we could do was speak out on social media. And I think that's why it got big on social media, or take it to the streets. And that's what we did.
That's what you did as well, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that. But obviously, as you said, the narrative was echoed across mainstream media, and there is one voice that countered that narrative on social media, a Dutch teenage journalist who was among those who witnessed and recorded everything that was happening in Amsterdam. His reporting has gone viral. Take a look.
Het is wel een flinke stoet. Oh, ze zijn palen uit de grond aan het jatten. Ze hebben palen uit de grond gejat. Ik denk om zichzelf te weren van mensen die ze lastigvallen. Oh, ze doen nu allemaal maskers op. Er is geen politie, dus ik weet niet precies. Het is nogal een heel gespannen sfeertje. Oké. Ja, politie. Oké. Ze gaan achter mensen aan. Veel politie. Ze hadden van die bouwvakkerspalen uit de grond gehaald. En die op andere mensen gegooid en op die politiebussen. We zijn weer eens, zoals altijd, de enige media die er is.
Bassil, you're a journalist. How much disconnect did you find between what was happening in the streets of Amsterdam and what was shown by mainstream media?
There's a giant disconnect. And I think the most disappointing thing is you had people who weren't even in the city at the time commenting on X and other platforms that there was a pogrom going on here, and that's completely wasn't the case. And I would pick up on a couple of ideas that have been stated. Not only do I think it's safe to be a Jew in Amsterdam, I think it's even safe to be an Israeli in Amsterdam. There isn't a day when I'm in the De Pijp neighborhood where I don't hear Hebrew being spoken in the streets. And I think in general, the spirit of Amsterdam is you can believe whatever you want to believe, you can be whomever you want to be, but there has to be a certain modicum of respect for people who might have differing beliefs. And, another point to make is that, the framing of this has been, oh, it's Jews against Muslims. And that's also not the case at all in Amsterdam. In every single part of the city, in the north, in the south, in the east, in the west, you see Palestinian flags everywhere. So it's not just in Turkish communities or Moroccan communities, where all these incidents happen near the city center. That's the home of the Provo movement of the 1960s. There are anarchist bars, anarchist squat houses that are there. And if you've been to really any protest over the past year, you'll see the rainbow culture of Amsterdam. Every single color and creed is there. And as an issue, a ceasefire, an arms embargo has majority support, not just in Amsterdam, but all of the Netherlands. I mean, I saw a poll back in May that said even voters that classify themselves as center-right or right conservative, even a majority of them support an arms embargo on the Israeli state. So, this took basically the framing of the far right and presented it as reality, and also ignored, the reporting of that young man and the reporting of a lot of other journalists that were on the ground and caught the Maccabi hooligans red-handed, so to speak.
One of the interesting things is how much, as Martina mentioned, social media has helped contribute to get the facts right, but it's also been quite a lot of things circulating. I mean, Usaama, a photographer based in Amsterdam, tweeted on Friday that a video she recorded was actually used without her consent. This post with her video read, "Breaking news, Middle Eastern migrants continue to hunt down Jews in the streets of Amsterdam." She actually replied to this person saying that he was spreading fake news and that was actually a group of Maccabi supporters starting a fight. How much would you say, however, that despite these cases of misinformation, social media is actually setting the record right here?
Yes, I think, I was just reading Moyen Rabbani's thread on it earlier, and he mentioned that on the same day there's a Portuguese synagogue, I believe, in Amsterdam, where they had a service to commemorate Kristallnacht, and he was like, Nobody reported that that service was going on and all those Jews were just chilling, right? So there is not only the spin that's involved, there's also the omission of what's actually happening in the city. Most of us that are commenting on it, myself included, don't really have much of a context of Amsterdam, right? And so people often will just feed it into whatever narrative that they're already kind of catching on to. But to answer your question, yes, I think social media, especially like with this incredible child journalist, it allows us to be able to have sometimes an inside view that we otherwise wouldn't get if we were just reading the BBC and Guardian articles on it.
And it has done so over the past year and a half, I would say. Martina, you mentioned that after the events, authorities actually banned protests and demonstrations in the city. Why was it important for you, for example, to join these demonstrations?
Because we cannot let the politicians and the media that have been complicit in what's been happening, we cannot have them hold a claim onto this narrative. We felt very strongly that we needed to speak out. And despite there was a protest ban, right? Like everybody coming there knew that there were risks involved. But despite these risks, there were still over 1,000 people there. A lot of people got arrested and the police got really violent.
And we got to speak to one activist who attended that rally on November 10th and got detained for being there. They sent us a video describing what they experienced while in police custody. Take a look.
This is a testimony of my detention on Sunday, 10th of November in the Dam Square in Amsterdam during the pro-Palestine and in defense of our right to protest demonstration. I was in detention inside of a van, a closed van, a metal cell from around 3:05 until 3:50 when the van started driving and then took us to one of the police stations. During the time that I was locked in that cell inside of the van, I have asthma and I couldn't breathe, so I started feeling anxious and uncomfortable, and in that moment I realized that on the cell next to me there was another person. They also started getting anxious and ended up having a panic attack. I could only listen them asking for help. Nobody was assisting us until a certain point when they put another detainee inside of my cell. In that moment, we really begged the police officers to let us go and help the person that was in the cell next to us inside of the van. They refused. It was really horrible to be locked in that cell without knowing where we're going to be taken, without knowing what is happening, and knowing that there is a person next to us who is suffering, asking for help, and nobody's listening.
Usaama, I want your take now on the big picture here. We've seen this happening across developed countries over the past year and a half. Police responding sometimes very harshly to these protests, even in places where freedom of speech is supposed to be respected and where people have the right to demonstrate. A year and a half into this, we still see people taken to the streets, like in Amsterdam, to voice their opinions. Would you say that there's no turning back now, that people can't really unsee what they saw, that they can't forget what they've learned, and that we are, in a way, different, and that politicians will eventually have to listen and have to accept that people want a different outcome?
Yeah, it's already happening. It's been happening incrementally. It's harder for us sometimes in the movement to notice all of these things changing, but they are incrementally changing. And you have increasingly company after company, state after state that is beginning to disentangle itself from the Zionist state. I think in terms of, in relation to what we saw in Amsterdam, my hope would be is that we can take a step back, because I know that they have fixtures in other places coming up, and people are kind of really hype about it and saying, okay, when they come to our city, we won't welcome them in our city and that kind of stuff. And I think from my perspective, the imperative is to kind of take a step back and just keep the perspective that our objective here is not simply just to antagonize people or to enact our righteous anger, righteous indignation, but our objective here is to alienate the state. And so our objective is the boycott of these teams, right? And so that's one of those steps. But I do agree with you that there's no turning back. And I think that now that it's spilled into the public square like this, you're not going to be able to contain it. And this will spread to other cities and other countries, for sure.
Sorry.
Go ahead, Martine, your take.
Yeah, because there's one thing I want to add to this that I think has been really hopeful for me, is that there are being coalitions built that I haven't seen before. To give you an example, last Sunday after the protest, I was not detained myself, but I was violently replaced by the police to another location. And it was the taxi drivers, the same taxi drivers that clashed with the hooligans a few days earlier, that connected us on social media, picked us up from wherever the police was dropping us and brought us home or brought us back to the square. So I do think what's really hopeful here is that there are new coalitions being built that I haven't seen before.
That's interesting, and that's a nice story. Bassil, in terms of sports, we've been hearing for a while now a lot of criticism in terms of the double standards behind these organizations, such as UEFA's refusal to ban Israel, for example, the same way they banned Russia from virtually every competition. But the pushback from UEFA was to say, well, Israel was attacked first, again, as if history started on October 7th and nothing justifies October 7th, but October 7th justifies everything. How long would you say this argument can last? How long until the world of sports actually dissociates itself from Israel as well?
It's a good question. I think hypocrisy rules the day. Obviously, UEFA is trying to frame it as if the world started on October 7th, and things have changed even since October 7th, right? Israel has invaded Lebanon. That is even more analogous to the Russia-Ukraine situation. And still, Israeli clubs are competing in UEFA competitions, and Israel hasn't been suspended from FIFA. I don't really have a lot of confidence in the sporting organizations, so to speak. I think even if you look at how they treated Russia, the knee-jerk reaction from Gianni Infantino, the president of FIFA at the time, was to say, oh yeah, Russia can still compete, but they have to compete under a neutral flag. And their bluff was called by the captains of the European teams that were going to play in World Cup qualifying, the likes of Poland's Robert Lewandowski, Sweden's captain, the Czech Republic's captain at the time. Those three came together and put out a statement and said, hey, listen, if we have to play them, we're going to withdraw. We just won't play. And that is what kind of created the pressure. So I think the sporting bodies are differential to power, and they will be probably the last to act. I think just the sporting bodies in general, because people tend to make the comparison to apartheid South Africa, but the sporting bodies have radically changed. There's more money involved, and power is concentrated in the hands of the executive councils of the respective organizations. I think what you're more likely to see happen, especially after this, is that cities just step in and say, listen, we don't want anything to do with this. We will not host these teams. And then they'll have to find other locations to host these teams. So, for example, in the Nations League, Israel couldn't play in Belgium because no city was willing to kind of put up with the headache. And in retrospect, that was quite a justifiable decision. So they played in Debrecen in Hungary. Yeah. Italy took a slightly different approach, and they found a relatively tiny city, Udine, hard to get to, and hosted the match there. And I think that's probably what we're going to see in the immediate aftermath. And we already know that Maccabi Tel Aviv's next away match, which was supposed to be in Istanbul, is going to be hosted in Debrecen, because you cannot host a normal football match when you have to welcome these types of supporters into your city, because these types of supporters aren't there to watch football. They give football supporters a bad name. And it's quite ironic, right? Because Israel always jumps up and down and says, hey, why are you mixing politics with sport? We want nothing to do with that. It just focus on the football. But the Maccabi Ultras themselves politicized everything from the moment they got to Amsterdam, right? So they kind of want it both ways. But I think to answer your question, I don't see a boycott coming to fruition in the way people are talking about it. I think just cities are going to wash their hands of it, because it costs the taxpayer a lot of money to kind of police these things.
And that's what I was going to say. And maybe we'll come from the residents of these cities themselves. Unfortunately, we are out of time, but I want to thank Bassil, Martina, and Usaama so much for joining us. Thank you for being part of the stream today. And thank you all for tuning in. Keep the conversation going online. You can use the hashtag or the handle AJStream, and we will look into your questions and suggestions. Take care, and I'll see you soon.